Okay.
Yes.
Yes, it's red now. We must be recording.
Is it red now? Okay,
Yes.
good. So, once again, I would like to say good afternoon to everybody who is with us this afternoon. And myself and Monica today have the honor to have as our very special guest, Professor Mark Turner, who will be talking to us about the role of conceptual blending in how human beings imagine our futures. Professor Mark Turner, we would very much like to thank you for your time and availability in agreeing to be part of the first CIGELP. But before you start, I would like to say a few words about your outstanding academic career. Mark Turner is Institute Professor and Professor of Cognitive Science at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, USA. Before joining the faculty at Case, he was Distinguished University Professor at the University of Maryland and Associate Director of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. Among many other attributions, Professor Turner is also the founding director of the Cognitive Science Network and co-director of the Red Hen Lab and founding president of the Murfield Institute for Cognition and the Arts. He has won prizes and awards from distinguished academies in the United States and abroad, and is extraordinary member of the Humanities Center of the Ludwig Maximilians University of Munich in Germany. Mark Turner has authored a vast number of important books in the fields of cognition and mind theory, such as The Origin of Ideas, Blending Creativity and the Human Spark, The Artful Mind, Cognitive Science and the Riddle of Human Creativity, More Than Cool Reason, a Field Guide to Poetic Metaphor, in co-authorship with George Lakoff, The Way We Think, Conceptual Blending and the Mind's Hidden Complexity, in co-authorship with Gilles Falconier. This is only a small sample because there are many, many other titles. For people interested in finding out more about Mark Turner, he has his own site, and you can check that on markturner.org. There you find all the information that you might still need. Now I invite Professor Turner to speak to us about blending stories and frames in imagining our futures. Mark, the word is yours now.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm deeply grateful to GELP Colin and also to Anna and Monica for arranging this. It's terrifically difficult to arrange these things. There's an enormous amount of work in the background. And we never show that in the front office, but the back office is working. And this is a service to linguists and cognitive scientists worldwide. So we all want to applaud GELP Colin and Anna and Monica before we start. So
thank you very much.
We have about 25 minutes together and then questions. So let me share a little bit of a slideshow here with you. Yeah, I want to present yeah, right here. Okay. The machine says Mark Turner is presenting. So as Anna said, if you go to markturner.org, you can see my coordinates and download papers and some books, almost everything that I talk about here, and see podcasts and recordings. and citations of other people's works, and in general, an introduction to the kind of research that I do. Now, my topic is one that's right in our focus these days, because we live in the time of COVID-19, of coronavirus, and everybody is wondering what the future is. And it's contested. People debate about it all the time. And yet, we seem to be able to conceive of possibilities and debate them, and we grasp them very quickly. So here's an example of a sudden presentation of the future. It's going global. Now notice that this is not an easy mapping, although we understand it immediately. It does not mean that we do not construct the meaning that the virus is a planet. We do not construct the meaning literally or even metaphorically that its spikes are somehow satellites in orbit. Of course, they're not in orbit. But we don't do it in the other direction. We don't suddenly have the idea that the Earth is a virion, is a virus. No, but we do construct a future according to which the influence and effect of the coronavirus will be huge. California's budget, this is the dome of a building in California. And we don't think that there's only one virion for coronavirus and that it flies through the cupola of the state capitol and leaves its imprint. We don't think that it trails money behind it. There are many, many different kinds of links here, all compressed to this tight little scene that we use to understand, immensely complicated. Here's one for the future. That happens very commonly, that we're presented with a prospect of the future. And what we're supposed to do is imagine the present and the migration path from here to that future. And so this is, of course, showing us a future that, or a proposed future that we don't want, where everybody dies because they make mistakes. And one of them is you didn't wear a face mask during the coronavirus. Now notice, of course, there are no cemeteries named Hindsight Cemetery. Tombstones do not list on them the reason for the death. It's immensely complicated, but we know that this is a warning about our future. Many, 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 I have hundreds of these by now, many, many with COVID-19 as an individual virion, not billions of them. And here, this is an intentional agent who can speak and says, I have tickets to all the major events this year, right? Showing you tickets for Comic-Con and things like this. You know that a virus doesn't need a ticket, but you know how to put this together. Here we're going to have the stock market go down because the Dow seems to be a little disrupted. And some of these patterns happen again and again and again. So I have scores of examples where the future is a wave, right? And it's the coronavirus or it's the second wave, right? Now, my little presentation here has three parts, three things that I would like to stick in our heads. This is a new project for me. I'll be working on it for some years. And here's why I'm working on it. The first part is this is extremely strange that human beings can think about the future in this way. Other species, of course, have behavior that has downstream consequences. They mate, they migrate, they fly, they do marvelous things, right? These are instinctive and almost always species-wide, and they have to do with important things: food, fighting, fleeing, reproduction. But there's no evidence, even in dogs, even in chimpanzees, that any other species can do something like think about what the future of Sweden will be, given that they're not doing the lockdown that we are. I have been in Sweden often, but I'm not there now. And they're not doing what I'm doing now. Notice that what Sweden is doing is not something that I have in my memory. I can't call up a memory of it. I have no experience of Sweden under its current practices. It's very, very strange that we should be able to do this. The problem is that we have actually very limited brains in a way, that is, everything that we have in order to be thinking about time in the future is present right here, right now. That is, our brain and its biology is here now, our bodies are here, the material anchors that we use, the sounds and the voices that we hear, they're all sort of in our present moment. And yet, so this is at human scale, but somehow we can use this very local embodied biology in order to think of things far in the future, centuries in the future, and even about the past. And it's not that memory sort of brings the past into our mind, because of course memory, there is no window that lets the past into our mind. Memory is right here, right now. Memory is a biological process that we're running right now. And so there's a startling mismatch between the tools we have for producing these thoughts and the vastness of the thoughts that we can produce. Human beings are off the scale on this. Naturally, there's a lot of difficulty, error, and failure. So the question is really, how can here and now minds hold vast ideas? In science fiction, it's because there's actual science fiction. So Doctor Who can go across space and time, but that's because he's got a TARDIS, which actually does go pretty instantaneously across space and time. We have a TARDIS too, but it's our ability to think. But this is an open cognitive scientific problem. We have concepts that stretch across time, space, causation, and agency. My students call this CATS: causation, agency, time, and space. Just think of something like the stock market or COVID-19. Just across time, across space, so much causation, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of agents involved, but somehow we can get a grip on it. And if one looks at law, you'll see how important this is, how almost all of law depends upon this ability to think of across causation, agency, time, and space. And there's a review of that in the Southern California Law Review. Matt McCubbins and I published this article on concepts of law and the way that it's the cognitive science of time, space, causation, and agency, but has been studied very often since sort of the beginning of neuroscience. The actual performance of this thinking is not permanent, it's very brief, it's in the moment. So the first part is, although we're human beings and we take it for granted, the reason I'm engaged in this study is that the fact that human beings can conceive of mass distant futures stretching across time, space, causation, and agency is one of the largest, most difficult open problems in science. How can we do that with our limited abilities? And I'm not saying that other species don't have robust behavior for downstream consequences. They don't have to think about it, right? And we have a lot of that too. So somebody does not have to think about how cute it would be to have great-grandchildren in order to be attracted to someone with whom they could reproduce, right? Because evolution has put lust right into the body, which is here and now. It's a present symptom that has downstream consequences, but we don't have to think about them. But we can think about setting up trust funds for our grandchildren before we even have a partner with whom we can have a child. How do we do this? That's part one, open scientific problem, and I look forward to your contributions. The second thing is that we blend to achieve human scale. We use blending and compression in order to take things that are far beyond the human scale in order to turn them into something that's human scale so that we can grasp it. And as is commonly studied in cognitive science and cognitive linguistics, much of this depends upon our ability to use image schemas and force dynamics, which we have a direct understanding of from our embodied experience, and to blend things that are not at human scale with image schematic and force dynamic structure so as to make it at human scale. So if you looked back at all those cartoons about COVID that I showed you at the beginning, every one of them takes some basic image schemas and some basic force dynamics that we understand at human scale, limited number of agents, and compresses something that's wildly complicated by blending it with something that is much more at human scale. An example of this is sort of linear scales, but there are many geometric techniques for doing this. And by geometric, I just mean using forms of force dynamics and image schemas in order to create things like a linear scale where there's a source path goal and things can go along that path. We have time and motion along a path, of course. This has been studied an awful lot. A path can be a linear scale. Gilles Fauconnier had a brilliant article on linking linear scales. So, for example, we have an experience of two people hand in hand moving along a path, or someone carrying something along a path. So the person goes along the path, but so does the thing carried, or so does the person with whom they're linked. So link is an image schema, path is an image schema. And you can blend the other thing that's moving on the path with something that is in fact not physical and on a path. So we can have a linear scale for time, but we can also have a linear scale for height. And we can link those linear scales and so say things like, well, people grow taller as they age. See, growing taller as one ages is not side by side linked linear scales, but we can blend aging in time with linked linear scales and make a compression that is tractable, right? We think the faster the water flows, the faster the boat goes. The faster the water goes, the more the force of the water on you. The faster the water flows down the street, the cleaner the street will be. The more water you pour, the fuller the bottle. These kinds of linked linear scales are just indispensable. And some of these linear scales get linked in pragmatic ways that seem just obvious to us, but are immensely complicated. Fauconnier in 1975 pointed out, for instance, that if you say Tommy will not eat the most delicious food, it could mean that the only thing he doesn't eat is the most delicious food. But almost everybody will interpret this to mean Tommy won't eat anything. Because if he won't eat at what's at the top of the linear scale, then you infer that the same is true for the rest of the linear scale. Very complicated attempt to understand causation in the world in this way. And of course, Fillmore, Kay, and O'Connor have a long study of this in regularity and idiomaticity, the case of let alone, where they point out that you can say, you can't get Mary, let alone Bob, to wash, let alone wax, your car, let alone your truck, for $10, let alone $5. And in order to understand that, you have to construct 4 on-the-fly linear scales and link them. But it's extremely quick for us. And notice what we're talking about here is a counterfactual future of who might wash your car, right? How do you bring that into conception so you can hold on to it? And there are lots of other sort of form patterns that human beings know from embodied experience that we can bring to bear for these kinds of compressions. Gilles and I, for instance, have an elaborate analysis of the role of these kinds of compressions actually in studying in time and space, and the way in which the two-space ontological mapping between time and space with entrenched vocabulary is only just the slightest sliver of the tip the iceberg of what's actually going on. You can download this article from my site if you look like. Now, in thinking about the future, once you have image schemas, journeys in a self, it's very common for people to think of the future as the self is on a journey. And of course, culture after culture extends this to be both before life and after life. So the stork brings the baby, mapping birth, journeys to birth, journeys through life, but also death. New York Times had an article on the discovery of a 4,000-year-old manuscript, the Book of Two Ways, which is a guide to the journey that you're going to have after life. And of course, the Egyptian Book of the Dead and the Tibetan Book of the Dead do exactly this in extraordinary detail, trying to compress, using image schemas and force dynamics, a sense of the future so that it can be understood, all of these images with which we're so entirely familiar. But it also happens in Aztec, that has its world into which you journey with very complicated kind of stuff and companions. Now, let's look at the use of some of these kinds of linear scales and how complicated it can be in thinking about the future. Here is an editorial where the National Public Radio had an editor, an opinion columnist, that essentially wanted us to understand that in the future we were not going to have any fish because we were overfishing. Well, how do you get people to conceive of that? What the opinion columnist said is, we're eating the food off our children's plates. When we overfish, we eat not only today's fish, but tomorrow's fish too. So this is an incredible compression using linked linear scales, and it goes like this. So there's an amount of fishing, which is a linear scale, and that has an effect, a cause-effect link across time to consumption of fish, because when you fish, you don't actually eat. First, you catch it. Much, much later down the causal chain, do you actually eat it? It has to be shipped, you have to cook it. But we feel that there is a link between the amount of fishing and the amount of consumption. And another link, cause-effect, another couple of links across a lot of time to the amount of stock of fish that remains in the ocean. Very complicated when you think about it. It's taking causation, agency, time, and space, and compressing it with linked linear scales. But of course, if you fish more, then there will be more consumption and less, smaller stock available. All right, but then what do you do? Well, you actually have to compare them, see, and use analogy and disanalogy between the two different situations and compress. So now, if there is less stock available in the future than there would have been if you had not overfished, then there's a blend in which there are missing fish. Notice how weird this is, right? The idea that there are fish, they just happen to be missing. But now in this linear scale, you know, the first part of the scale is the fish that exist, and the other part of the scale is the missing fish, the fish that would have been there if you hadn't overfished. So you have to do that for the stock, but you also have to do it with the consumption, and we have linguistic phrases for this, not just missing fish, but overconsumption. Think about the cognitive work we have to do, the blending compression, in order to get over consumption. Where is this overconsumption? Well, it's on a linear scale. There's overfishing, missing fish, overconsumption. And when you then compress it all with something else, which is actually eating the food at your dinner table, notice fishing and consumption of fish in the future and missing fish in the future are not eating the food right at your table right now. But in order to get even greater human scale, I compress it with eating the fish. Except now, notice you're not just eating the fish, you are taking the fish off your children's plate, which brings in the frame of something very bad. It's something very much at human scale. Somebody deprives their child. We have that frame. It's a social frame. So now overfishing is eating the food off your children's plate. And notice they say food instead of fishing because there are a lot of children who don't like to eat any kind of fish except fish sticks. And on and on and on. I got a full analysis of this, really complicated, trying to get somebody to conceive of possible futures by using blending compressions to linked linear scales. There are many such examples I could give. I recommend in particular Maria Magdalena Hedlund's thesis. She's a computer scientist, an engineer, and a cognitive linguist. And she has been working on a system for blending image schemas so as to create embodied image schematic and force dynamic concepts that we can use then in blending to understand other things like the future. It's quite an elaborate thesis. There is, so I sail, and here's an example of looking at the future. If you see a boat on a horizon or something on the horizon, how do you figure out whether you will hit it, right? You can't communicate it. Maybe the GPS doesn't work. But there's a standard technique, and that is you just stand on your boat and look across in a fixed line of vision at that thing. And you see if it stays there and is getting closer, then you're going to hit it. So you shouldn't follow that course. Well, how do you get there? Well, we have the idea of a ship going along a path, so image schemas, and leaving a track. Now notice that the wake of a boat disappears very quickly, but we can use the track as a path over time, and we can present it here statically, right? Graphs do this all the time. So we can blend that with a ship moving, and now the ship moves along a course. Now we can do this not only once, we can do this twice for two different ships. And so we now have an imaginary course of two ships. So let's focus on that. Will they collide? Well, you don't know where they are. You don't know how far they are, but there are 3 points somewhere. There's a boat out there. You're a point. And if you're going to collide, there has to be a point where you meet at the same moment. And if that happens, then the same percentage of the course for each boat has to be completed in the same amount of time. And so you get an imaginary triangle. Now notice you don't know anything about this triangle in the sense that you don't know what its angles, you don't know how long the legs are, but you compress all the different triangles to one triangle and the differences in them to change for that one triangle. And so we call this the shrinking triangle. If you're going to hit the other boat, there's going to be a shrinking triangle. Bing. And then you hit it. So you do this and look for the shrinking triangle, and it tells you how to chart your course. It tells you what to do, right? Now, dogs are brilliant. They have fabulous smell. They can do all kinds of things, and you can take them to sea. They're really, really good. But there's no dog, even as brilliant as dogs are, who has any hope of constructing something like a shrinking triangle, even if they're looking at the boat out there. Whereas you can teach this to a 5-year-old child in 5 minutes, right? Because human beings have the equipment for these kinds of blended compressions. The one you don't want is where you hit. What you want is the counterfactual one where you don't hit. In other words, you're safe. It's a very common kind of compression of analogies to uniqueness and disanalogies to change for that. You see it, for instance, in explanations of things like the evolution of birds from dinosaurs. No dinosaur turned into a bird. You had lots and lots of dinosaurs. They were all different, but you compress the analogies to one thing, the dinosaur, the species, and the differences across generations to change for that species. And now we can say the dinosaur turned into dinosaurs turned into the birds. These techniques of sort of geometrical compressions of image schemas and force dynamics are what we use, for example, in presenting ideas of possible futures like the weather. All you have to do is watch the weather report every day and you'll see all the techniques that I'm talking about. They compress across time and space and possibility using image schemas and in very interesting ways. You see this, I hope you see this, the cone enlarges as it goes up. We do not interpret that, or it's not meant as, the hurricane enlarging. The width of that cone is not the size of the hurricane. In fact, you see the hurricane just going up about. The width of that cone is the degree of ignorance. We don't know where the hurricane will be, and we know less and less for the future. So here you have a visual, image schematic, dynamic representation of probabilities of the future. Very standard for us. The kind of thing you use in graphs, lovely while it lasts. The Dow Jones is a kite, compression across time, space, causation, and agency. Time, space, causation, and agency, cats. And so here's one. Joey, Katie, and Todd will be performing your bypass. They all look about 10 years old. The one place that you will never see 10-year-olds is operating in a medical surgery theater, right? But this is a time compression trying to motivate you. You know, if you want, before you know it, these kids will be operating on you, right? So donate to their education. And so there's a long science of compression and expansion and a vast number of examples. The cyclic day, cycles of calendars, cycles in music, cycles of Krebs, cycles of oral poetry, and so on that we could go into. There's also symmetry used in compression. So what I'm saying now is that one way to take things that are vast in causation, time, and space and not here, and that are not supplied directly in memory, is to use these embodied image schemas and force dynamics blending to create things that are human scale. So that's the second part. The first is, this is a vast open scientific problem, and one line of attack on the problem is the analysis of blending that uses human scale embodied knowledge in order to produce compressions of things that otherwise would be intractable for human cognition. The third part of this talk, and that's it, is the blending of frames and the blending of stories. Now, you have to have image schemas and force dynamics and things like that in order to have conceptual frames and conceptual stories. Charles Fillmore discussed this in his theory of conceptual frames and the case for case and construction grammar and grammar clauses being relativized to scenes. I discussed this all in The Literary Mind, and also blending of stories in The Literary Mind. You can find it in The Origin of Ideas. Some of it's in The Way We Think. Remember, all you have to do is go to markturner.org, and they're deep resources for studying any of this if you like. Literary Mind has got an early summary of some of these devices, but that work has also been extended into politics, economics, law, and society. In particular, you can download from my website an article on double scope stories and an article on frame blending that'll go through the introduction to the issue I want to talk about now. So here's an example of a kind of frame blend. The child is on the beach, and it's your beach, and somebody wants to know if the child is safe. And you say the child is safe. What's going on there is there's a situation, there's a frame for the situation, it's a beach and it's waves and so on. But there's another frame for harm, which gets discussed in Fillmore and Atkins quite a bit. And when you say the child is safe, notice, by the way, you could say the beach is safe and mean exactly the same thing. So if you think that adjectives predicate a feature of the noun, predicate adjective here, that's not right, because these things could mean the same thing. What the word safe does is ask you to call up two frames and to blend them such that you get harm in the present situation. And then to understand that that's a hypothetical future, but it is counterfactual to the present situation. And therefore, the counterfactual relationship between them gets compressed to the situation like a feature. And now the situation is safe. You know that when someone uses the word safe, you have to use this blending compression, but you have to do an awful lot of interpretive work. You have to figure out, for example, what the victim of the harm is. If I say, well, you know, this jeweler is safe, and what I mean is won't damage the diamond, the person who would have the harm is actually the owner. If I say this packaging is safe, I might mean that the packaging gets destroyed, but it's going to protect what's on the inside. So safe tells you to use a certain blending compression mapping scheme, but that's about all it tells you. Then you have to go and, from context and your own knowledge, try to fill it in until you think you've got a relevant interpretation. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a second so that I can look at you. Yes, I am. And so stop sharing, right? And I'm just going to tell you two other kinds of stories. The first one is in Phaedra, Racine's Phaedra. Phaedra is the stepmother of Hippolytus. Hippolytus is the son of Theseus. His mother was Ariadne, who is Phaedra's older sister. And Phaedra is quite young compared to Theseus, her husband. And so she is the stepmother of Hippolytus, and she falls in love with him, madly, passionately in love with him. And she does not want to tell him. So she's talking to him when Theseus is not there. And she says, you know, I miss your father, not the way he is now, but the way he was when he went down and he conquered the Minotaur. And you look just like him. Why couldn't you have been the one who came down? Why, you could have conquered the Minotaur, and I would have helped you. Unlike my sister Ariadne, who just gave a thread, I would have gone into the maze, into the labyrinth with you. I would have been motivated by what I saw and my great affection and admiration, and I would have gone into the labyrinth with you, your lover, to die with you or to escape together. And Hippolytus is kind of surprised by this. And he says, wait, are you forgetting that Theseus is my father? And she says, what do you mean? This is just an analogy. Could you do a little analogy? And she says, oh, cruel one, you understand all too well. Right now, what's happening here is you have two stories. There's the story of Phaedrus and Theseus and Hippolytus, and where they are now in the present. And you also have the story of Theseus and the Minotaur. And in an elaborate way, Phaedra blends them. So now in the blend, Phaedra and Hippolytus are lovers. It's completely, she can dissociate herself from this, but she's constructing new emergent meaning. Hippolytus slaughters the Minotaur. She's in love with them. They live together. And of course, the reason she's doing this is to suggest to him a future for them, right? And you might think that this, well, okay, Greek tragedy or French renditions of Greek tragedy, but I see this all the time. So for example, I knew a man who was in the wedding party. He was a groomsman. And the wedding was taking place on the cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean in front of an apartment I lived in. And his girlfriend was not with him. But they had been diving in Cabo San Lucas 3 weeks before. And while the wedding was going on, he was imagining marrying his girlfriend, right? So he wasn't confused. He didn't think he was the groom or that he was going to marry the present bride or anything like that. But he put together the current scene of the wedding with him and his girlfriend, and he hadn't thought about this before. But as they're going along, when it comes time for the bride to say, I do, in his mental blend of this, the bride hesitated. right? And so he was very upset that maybe he hadn't realized that his girlfriend was just toying with him, that she wasn't serious. And he was quite distressed. So he was taking the story of the present wedding, where he knew the bride and the groom, but his girlfriend wasn't here, with the story of him and his girlfriend in Cabo San Lucas, which he was thinking about. He wasn't getting confused. At the wedding, he wasn't swimming down the aisle the way he was in the other story. He didn't mistake the bride for a shark, but he made this amazing blend of the future in which he's getting married to his girlfriend. Now, these kinds of blends, it turns out, have structures. They repeat again and again. And so now I'll go back. This is Hippolytus. This is the wedding and the divers. These kinds of blends can be projected. You don't seem to be seeing the thing that I'm seeing. So let me stop sharing and share again. Stop sharing. And now I'll share again. I'm monitoring what you are seeing. So let's do that. And I will go here and say share. And then I will come over to this and say, there you go. Okay, now we're back. So you've heard about the wedding, but these kinds of blends for the future can be prompted by just a single word. In Shakespeare's Sonnet 3, he wants his friend to get married. And we know the story of marriage and having kids, right? So he takes the present situation in the frame of marriage. And then there'll be a future in which not only will the friend have a child, but some woman in Shakespeare's representation will be very lucky because she will be the mother of this child. She'll be blessed, right? And so what he says is, if you don't reproduce now, you're going to unbless some mother. Now, unbless is not actually a word of English. I haven't been able to find it anywhere else. I mean, popes don't go out and unbless people. They may do other things, but they don't unbless as a word. But this is a way of getting someone to understand that an action in the present has consequences to the future. And a future that was hypothetical, in which the woman is blessed, now becomes a future in which that woman, and we don't know who it is, becomes unblessed. On and on and on. In songs, sometimes the people in the future show up and explain to you the future and tell you how to get there. They make a blend of you and bad things if they want you not to go down that path. Or if it's in the voice, they make a blend of good things that will lead you to the future. Al Gore, in An Inconvenient Truth, this is like my last example almost, wants us all to stop climate change. And he has to get us to conceive of that future. So he shows us a picture, it's right here, the pale blue dot of the Earth. Notice this is a compression. He says, everything that has ever happened in all of human history happened on that dot. So he's bringing it down to what you can see, human scale, right in front of your eyes. It's all right there. All the sagas, all the history, all the epics, right here. Compression of time and space, and agency, and causation. And he says that's what's at stake. And then he has this blend. So there's a huge spatial compression and a time compression for history. But then he's talking about the future. Future generations may well have occasion to ask themselves, what were our parents thinking? Why didn't they wake up when they had the chance? We have to hear that question from them now. Now, of course, all of these people are 25 generations from now. They're not your children. They're probably not speaking English. You couldn't possibly hear them. And we're not even talking about speaking. We're talking about what they think, what they publish, cartoons they make, what they suffer. But we all have the frame of children talking to their parent, and in particular, a child accusing the parent of failing the child. The very common story, compressed. agents in a frame that we know very well. So Al Gore takes this future, which runs across 25 generations and 20 billion people, 30 billion people, whatever's in the future, all over the world. This is a compression of causation, agency, time, and space down to children, a child accusing the parent of having failed them. And so one can respond to that. And that will be my last example. I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to present 3 points about my new project. One, how human beings can conceive of the future is one of the largest and most difficult open problems in cognitive science. And it's one that has immediate consequences. Everybody all the time is trying to do this in order to set policy, in order to improve our lives, in order to make decisions about their own character and personality and legacy. Two, we do this by blending and compressing using items that we know because they're at human scale. And the first sort of category of those items I looked at are embodied sort of geometric forms, image schemas, force dynamics, very, very complicated. However, once we do that, we also have conceptual frames and sort of brief stories. So we can blend conceptual frames and we can blend stories to create concepts of the future that are tractable to us, that we can comprehend, that we can discuss, but that otherwise would not be tractable to human thought. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present this.
Thank you, Mark, for a very enlightening, exciting presentation. Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. And now it's time for questions. That's all the time after the speaker has his chance, we open up for questions.
Absolutely.
Monica helps me in moderating this part of the meeting. And I wonder if she has noted down any questions yet, Monica. I don't know if she can hear me. I don't think she can. But anyway, have you been able to?
Sorry,
have you been able to note down any questions?
No, there weren't any questions here.
No questions.
So far,
No
nobody has. Yeah, probably they will start writing them now, or even
maybe just speak them out. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, we can maybe just invite the first person who would like to ask Mark a question. Is anybody there? Maybe I will start.
You can either write.
Francisco Mendoza has a question.
Yes.
Okay, Francisco.
Yeah, I see the question. It's about metonymy, and I've, of course, followed Francisco's work.
Okay.
As I see it in theory of blending, when one does blending, there are many, many kinds of vital relations. And a blending network can use all of those relations simultaneously and in quite complicated ways. And of course, some of those vital relations are what you would call metonymy. We have an awful lot of terms. Almost all of them, except blending, are classical Greek terms. Synecdoche, metonymy, climax, metaphor, and on and on, apostrophe, and on and on and on. These lists of things that people thought they saw in language that we've inherited. But I would say that these are shorthand labels that we use to try to talk about behavior and phenomena that we see. So I don't really actually care what labels one uses. What I care about is the analysis of the process that one thinks is going on. And if we agree on the analysis of the process, then you can use any, for my money, you can use any vocabulary you like. What I would like to say is that all the kinds of processes, very complicated, sometimes very specific, that we find in analysis of figuration are all available, and many more aside, inside blending. They work simultaneously and so on. So for example, it's often the case, as you know, that when someone says, well, this is a metonymy, if you actually analyze the network, there might be some vital relationships in there, a minority of them, that one would call metonymic, but there's a lot else going on at the same time. Similarly, most things that even strike people as a metaphor, like if Clinton were the Titanic, the iceberg would sink, or you're digging your own financial grave, certainly these strike people as metaphor. Most of the links in those networks are not metaphoric, and they have a lot else going on besides. They incidentally very often do not project structure from the source to the target of a crucial part. Take for instance on metonymy and you're digging your own financial grave. Certainly it is the case that it feels metaphoric for people. The shovel seems to be a metonymy for an instrument, for various kinds of instruments like buying and selling stocks. That's true. But if you look at it, you notice that, for example, the causal structure doesn't come from the source, it comes from the target. That is, digging a grave doesn't kill you, but investing poorly makes you go bankrupt. It's not the case that sextons digging graves don't know that they're doing it, but the whole point of this blend is to communicate to someone that they're being ignorant about what they're doing. So yes, the safe network does have parts that one would pick out and say, well, I kind of think that this is metonymic. That's fine. If anybody who presents that analysis and it's part of what's going on, that's fine. But labeling it stops us from analyzing it.
Okay. Francisco, would you like to add anything? Do you think
he says makes sense. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Right. Does anybody else want to ask a question? Maybe orally?
Sir Sandra Cavalcante.
Hello,
Okay.
Sandra.
Sandra? Does she have her mic on?
Hi, Mark. I just wrote here. I'd like if you...
Yeah, let me pause just a second and say Francisco asked another question, which is about variation in blends for conceiving of time. That's absolutely right. There are cultural conceptions of time that are important, even some that are lexicalized and grammaticalized, that are not linear. They're not source path goal. And we have quite a review of these in Rethinking Metaphor, but also in The Origin of Ideas. You'll see I take some of this up. So it's very important to say that having the mental capacity for blending, having the mental capacity for story, doesn't mean that you have the products. Cultures have to spend a lot of time inventing products, and conceptual products, and they often invent different conceptual products. Some of these we call languages, right? and they can do it in different ways, and they can even do it in different ways at different times. So for instance, everybody in the States and Brazil has both linear time and circular time, recurrent time, like the cyclic day. We say when dawn comes round again, right? That's one way to do it. The other way is dawn is a long way off, right? So anyway, I just wanted to say that's quite right. In order to assess the data, you have to be ready to indicate that different blends are going on in different cases. There are certain patterns that seem to arise again and again and again. There even seem to be some that almost every culture and every language that I know of have, right? But then there are lots that are strange between cultures, and that's a source of misunderstanding. Anyway, Sandra, sorry to have interrupted.
Yeah, her mic is off.
She'll unmute herself.
I have just asked her to switch on her mic.
She's got to find how to do it.
Sandra, yes.
Yeah, there she is.
Mark,
She's with us.
actually, I have just curiosity, Mark. These cats, causation, agency, time, space, is a kind of summary of your vital relations at the way we think?
It's deeply related. So, for example, way back in The Way We Think in 2002, Gilles and I tried to indicate the kinds of standard compressions for which we had evidence. And we showed a couple of trees. They're in The Way We Think, and I could show them here. The point is that when you compress analogy and disanalogy to change for a unique entity, that is going to give you a compression across individual units. It's going to give you a compression of individual units, and if they're agents, then it gives you a vast compression of agency. So dinosaurs, for example, are lots and lots and lots and lots. No dinosaur got more feathery. No dinosaur turned into a bird, but you can compress them all, right? It's a compression of amazing agency. And in fact, if you look at the cartoon of the dinosaur turning into a bird, it now has intentionality. Evolutionary scientists would hate this because they don't like the idea that, you know, evolution happens because you want it to happen. But in the blend, that dinosaur is chasing the dragonfly, trying to catch it. And, you know, the more wings, more feathers it has, and the more wings it grows, the faster it gets. And when it finally turns into a bird, then it gets what it wants. It gets its goal. So you have intentionality in the blend that is, in fact, not in the input spaces. So you're quite right. You get compressions of causation, agency, time, and space, but also compressions of intentionality and emergent structure. So yes, one of the things that I would do is take the various kinds of patterns of compression, and you know, some of them look metonymic, like part whole being compressed to an identity, right? This is a vital relation of part whole that gets compressed to an identity. And look at the patterns of compression we have, and then point out what they can be used for. Some of them are for causation, agency, time, and space. In fact, I could give you just a little example of here. Let me find the mythic race. If I go to documents, so here's one that we've actually you know, analyzed. Many of these are, and you can find them at markturner.org. So here's the mythic race. Yes, and I will make this large. You get an idea here of what's going on. I come back here and I say, I'm going to share my screen. Yes, I hold screen, and yes, and then I go back to this other slideshow. I say, okay, the New York Times ran this cartoon because they wanted to show you how fast Hicham El Garouche was when he set the world record in the mile. And so what they do is they take, notice by the way, this kind of compression is a representation compression. That little black dot is not a person. It's not Hicham El Garouche. The lines, the curved lines are not actually a racetrack, but I can say, so there he is on the racetrack, right? There he is on the racetrack. And I don't have to say there is a black dot that we interpret as a representation of the, no, you just do the representation compression. And there's a representation link and also an analogy link because of the topology. So the silhouette, the outlines kind of looks analogical to the body, the anatomical form of a person. And so, but they put the fastest milers of each of the previous 5 decades on the track where they would have been if they had run at a constant speed when they ran their fastest time. against Hikam el-Garouche. So it's a mythic race, right? These people, some of them, they certainly didn't race against each other. Some of them never even met each other, right? But now we can say Hikam el-Garouche defeated Roger Bannister by 120 yards. And what's really happening here is that you have these, all of these different spaces, and you're bringing in only some stuff from the different spaces. You bring in the mile track and fuse it, but you won't bring in only the winner from each of the input spaces, and you put them on the track, and you have amazing emergent prop structure. So now all of those other 5 people are losers, whereas up in the input spaces, they were not only winners, they were world record setters. And this kind of compression across causation, agency, time, and space is often used to present the future. So they'll put something into a blend like this that's not actually from the past, it's from the future, to try to get you to understand what it would be like for this event to happen. So yeah, these are tightly related projects, the kinds of compression schemes you have and what they compress. And I mentioned causation, agency, time, and space. There are others, but these things are really indispensable if you're going to conceive of your future. The problem with the fish, or the dog, or even the chimpanzee, is the bird, the New Zealand rook, is they're really, really smart and they have great instincts. But this ability to compress across causation, agency, time, and space in order to make it possible for the New Zealand rook to think about things that are not here, that are not in front of them, that are not instinctive, that are just, you know, thinking about, gee, wouldn't it be a great idea if we had more of us on some other island I haven't ever been to? It's just not available. And so I'm pressing on causation, agency, time, and space, because it seems to me everybody sees you have to be able to do that in order to have the simplest understanding of these futures of the sort that you get in the political cartoons about coronavirus. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Can I?
I have one question.
Hi, Lillian.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Lillian.
Hi.
Doesn't
Yes.
was Sandra going to say something?
Yes, can I ask another question?
Okay.
Sure.
And then after Lillian, we have Maiti's question as well that she wrote here.
And Sandra's.
Sorry, Lillian. Sorry,
No,
Lillian.
it's okay.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Mark, don't you think that the idea of I and the idea of you are 2 important dimensions of life that we have to consider in your how human being image or imagining the future?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As you know, in The Origin of Ideas, I have one chapter called The Idea of You.
Yeah.
And I say, it's really astonishing that a human being has a concept of another person as a stable person, not fixed, not rigid, but as a stable person. Of course, other species have concepts of conspecifics. So, you know, the chimpanzee recognizes that there's an alpha male, and the alpha male is probably going to get the food and things like that. These sort of, there's another agent there, and they're tied to right here, right now. And they're tied to fighting and fleeing and feeding and reproduction, things that are right at the scale of the chimpanzee. Dogs have been domesticated, or maybe they have domesticated us. Dogs are always the interesting one on these kinds of things, because they actually have behavior about, like, this is my master and things like that. Some of it seems to be evolutionary. I mean, the reason your dog obeys you is because you're the alpha dog, right? So there's impulse there. But in order to have a concept of another person as stable, you already have to be doing massive blending. And in this chapter, I analyze the usual patterns of how we create a concept of another human being's mind. Where does theory of mind come from? And I explained that theory of mind is crucial, but it's not a standalone module.
Okay.
Theory of mind is something that's made possible because you have these mental operations that produce other things besides theory of mind. So I talk about Tomasello and Simon Baron-Cohen and everything else. But in the next chapter is called The Idea of I, in which I go through how astonishing it is that people have a concept of themselves as a stable person with features, and how really miraculous this is and how much it's constructed. So I just blazed over that in my 30-minute, 40-minute talk, because notice when I talked about the self on a journey, I didn't say anything about the idea of I. But if you think of the self on a journey, I was just talking about image schemas, but I just took for granted the idea that you have a concept of self and that you're on a journey. But that's another talk. The way in which in a book that was called The Literary Mind, but it's not the book that I wrote. It's a collection of articles from a conference 15 years later that was called The Literary Mind, that was about that book. I have an article which you can download from markturner.org called Mind is an Autocatalytic Vortex. And I go through the many ways in which, in order to have a mental ability for story, you have to have the mental ability to create characters and to create selves, and how complicated that kind of compression is. So thanks very much for that question.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
Okay. Now in sequence, we have Eden, and then Maiti, and then I would like to ask a question as well. Okay, so first of all, let's listen.
Paulo.
And João Paulo, okay. So we have like 4 questions in the run now. Okay, Lillian, it's your turn now to ask your question.
Okay, it's just something that occurred to me during your talk. Is there a difference between blends that take the frame from the target and in relation to the ones that take the frame from the source?
Yeah, well, for starters, it's a brilliant question, and let me back up just a little. One of the most successful things I ever did when I was working with Gilles is to draw that 4-space diagram with input 1, input 2, the blend, and the generic space. That was just a fetish that I could put on the chalkboard so that when I was talking, I could point at various kinds of things. I have lots of articles explaining that you can have many more than 2 inputs to a blend. You just saw in the Mythic Race, there were 6, right? At least 6. This is very, very common. Blending is not a diagram. Blending is a process, and it can happen over huge networks, and it can happen anywhere in the network, and you can work anywhere in the network. Now, for those kinds of blends that people feel have a source and a target, and we do have to account for why they feel that way. So I have an article called Figure in a book called Figurative Language and Thought. It has 4 chapters. I wrote one of them, Gibbs wrote one, Katz wrote one, and Kachari wrote one. And then we all talk about it, right? And you can download this from markturner.org. Okay. I talk about why people respond to certain products by saying, well, this is metaphoric, or this is a category, or this is an analogy, or so on. And then these are a fine first pass thing to do, but they're not actually an analysis. So what I would say is that, as we discuss in the way we think, there are different purposes that we often recognize for blending. Sometimes the purpose is to solve a riddle. Sometimes the purpose is to make a decision. Sometimes the purpose is to give an understanding that we can use in action. So you all have a computer that has the desktop, right? You don't really think that they're little folders inside your computer, and when you click on them, they open up, and you don't think that at all. But it gives you an action pattern, a compressed action pattern. And now with intuitive gestures, it's even more, it lets you act, right? That is a purpose. Sometimes the entire purpose is not to live in the blend, but to solve for the relationship between the inputs. You need to know what the relationship is between these inputs. So in the mythic race, where Hikam El Garouche runs faster than everybody else, it's not really so that you live in the mythic race. You could in a science fiction kind of way. It's to get you to understand the precise mathematical relationship between the different inputs, right? We call that solving for the inputs. Now, you will often find cases where someone wants to persuade you and they take a frame that you already know and believe, and they bring that into the blend. So then you believe what the hope is that you will believe what they're saying about the other thing, because you're bringing in the frame structure that they already believe from this one. But notice you can also get it the other way. And you're digging your own financial grave. What I'm bringing in is the causal structure from what feels like the target. The causal structure is you invest and then you go bankrupt. I don't bring in you die and then somebody digs your grave. I bring in the agency from the so-called target. So in the target, the person who is doing the investing is the one who goes bankrupt. But in the digging, the person who is digging is not the one who dies or has died. And the action structure. In digging, there's just one action, one instrument, one person. So what I would say is, in this case, the purpose of the source is to provide you with the compression, not the conception. Most of the conception is actually coming from the target. So is there a difference? The answer is yes. You can get understanding, compression, and inferences from different inputs, and you can develop some in the blend that weren't in any of the inputs by emergent structure. And all of this has to be present in the analysis. You can't take it for granted. So for instance, assuming that because something feels metaphoric to you, the inferential structure is being mapped from the source, that just turns out in a lot of cases to be false. In some cases, it's true, right? But one has to be careful in analyzing these types. The types of blending, the ones that occur again and again and again, are many, 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 many.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, now it's Maiti's turn. Maiti Cicada. You there, Maiti?
Hi, Maiti.
Hi.
Okay.
I'd rather read my question because I have noises here, but okay.
No, I have it. Do I distinguish online?
Okay, so I'll turn my mic off because I have...
during conversation.
Okay.
Yeah, so one of the lectures I give a lot is how human beings use other things in order to think. It's always been the case from the beginning that human beings use a lot of things in the here and now to help them think. They use their bodies. You know, they count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? They will pantomime or simulate an action and see how they feel. They use the night sky. They look at the night sky and they tell stories about the night sky, and it helps them remember for agricultural purposes. Lots and lots and lots of external things that human beings deploy as props for understanding, things that are not in their brain. And one of the things that's not in anybody's brain is somebody else. But human beings are highly social, highly social. And once we have a concept of another person, and in that blend, you perform certain actions, you have certain kind of behavior, but I can't see your intentionality. It's not in my perceptual field. It feels that way. If I look at your eyes and your eyes, I say, oh, you know, I see interest in your eyes. But of course I can't see interest. What I can see is your eyes are a certain shape. But I know if I were behaving that way, then I would be interested. So you're either interested or you're pretending to be interested, right? So I'm projecting to the blend things I can only know about me. I can't actually feel your pain. But it feels that way when I see you doing something that looks like an experience of pain. And this kind of blending of self with other was been analyzed for millennia. Aristotle has an analysis according to which thinking of other people depends upon their appearance and their reactions, right? What you can see. You can see their appearance and you can see how they move. And you use that as a basis to attribute things to them, and then you adjust. So for instance, you're eating less spicy food than I would eat, so okay, maybe you like less spicy food. Or you speak English in a way that I don't speak it, so I make adjustment for that, right? Once you've got that idea of another person, then you are really, really set up to use that person in thinking. And if you watch people just talk, people will often conspire to work on a blend. And in particular, a blend about the future. They'll say, for instance, well, you know, if we had a popular vote, then Joe Biden would win the presidency. And the other, so this is a blend about the future, because in the United States, of course, it's a surprise to people. There is no such thing as a national popular vote. We vote by state. And in most states, except 2, it's winner take all. So if you did have a popular vote in the United States, everything would be different. People would campaign differently. They would go looking for money differently. You'd probably have different political parties and different political candidates, right? So someone on the other side will say, no, 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 no. If we have a popular vote, Biden wouldn't even be president. It wouldn't even be the candidate because of, so you work back and forth on building a blend. And so that may seem like one thing as opposed to when you're alone. But in fact, I would point out that even when you're alone, one of the things you can do is simulate other people. You can imagine what they would say. So you say, well, blah, blah, blah. Yes, but my wife would say, or my mother would say, or my brother would say, or my professor would say. So they're not there. But you have a stable concept of them. We use this all the time. So for instance, my maternal grandmother died in like 1972 or 1973. But she was with me throughout my entire youth. And so all the rest of my life, when I encounter something, I can always, you know, and people will say this, well, Mama would have said, and Mama is now saying things in my mind about stuff that she's never seen and never could have seen because it's modern and it didn't exist, right? I mean, there were no computers for here, but Mama would say, right? Okay, so when you're offline, it's not that you're all alone, that you're not using what you think of as other people's stories and other people's voices because you have a history of how they have reacted to you. And you can simulate those kinds of dispositions because you have an idea of them, right? Which is very complicated. You have an idea of them and boom, they pop up and they start participating in your blends. But I would say that for many, many kinds of things, when you're thinking about the future, when you're thinking about science, you often go looking for other people to work with you on constructing these kinds of blends. And in fact, I have papers on what I call blended classic joint attention that are just on this point. Joint attention is, of course, when various people feel that they're all attending to the same thing, and more than that, they know that they believe that they are interacting with each other by attending to it, right? And that they all know this. This is joint attention. Tomasello, lots of people have worked on it. And it's really classic. The classic joint attention is when you have 2 or a small number of people who are in joint attention and are communicating about it. So the mother says to her son, hey, Billy, look, that blackbird in the hedge has red stripes on its black wings, right? That's classic joint attention. Now, you can blend the classic joint attention with other things. So now you have blended classic joint attention. So for instance, right now, you are all not here. This is not classic joint attention. The temperature I'm feeling is not the temperature you're feeling. I don't know what it's like. I don't know what's behind. I can't turn around and see what you see. This is not classic joint attention. In many, many ways. Also, I'm not talking about a blackbird. I'm not talking about something that's in the ground of our perceptual fields. I'm talking about blending stories. But I can blend sort of stories or blending stories with the idea of the blackbird, with a thing that we could say. And now, in the blended classic joint attention blend, I'm actually talking about something. And you'll notice that if I'm talking about something, I'll sometimes put it somewhere. I'll say, well, if you want to talk about intellectual property, you know, intellectual property, and gesture compresses the whole world into this little space. And now we have blended classic joint attention. So the nature of blended classic joint attention is crucial. It really distinguishes human beings from other kinds of species. And you're quite right, it's indispensable in discursive situations. So what I would say is it's not just, you know, online, offline. They're not just two possibilities. There's a complex of ways in which you might interact with other people, including reading a personal letter. Now, the person's not there, but it's still blended classic joint attention. And they might say something that helps you or hurts you. And in fact, you might go read the letter exactly so you could get that kind of help or assistance or resistance. Thanks.
Okay, anything else, Mighty, would you like to add? Hi, Mighty.
I think she's done.
Yes, I think she is, right. Mark, I have a question myself.
Of course.
I would like to know, how do our brains do the filtering of information in the online reception of the blended information?
Yeah, boy, don't I wish if I knew the answer to that, I would probably win the Nobel Prize for Physiology or medicine. That's extremely difficult. One of the things that makes it very hard to research is, you know, consciousness is very, very tiny and very, very weak. We know that a ton of stuff is going on conceptually that never penetrates to consciousness. Basically, what you get in consciousness are mostly just the products. Little, like, here's the cartoon, and you understand the cartoon, and you don't see the process. You just bing. This is what this person's trying to say. It's the same for language. You're talking to me, I'm talking to you, and although we're linguists, we don't generally, I mean, it seems transparent. I understand what you're saying, right? So what pops into consciousness is, well, here's my understanding, right? Now, how you get something into consciousness is a huge question. We have certain kinds of answers that are very true, but not very helpful. So for instance, I would say human beings are really good at picking out form against motion against a background. So if I'm sitting here and the fly flies across my field of vision, it's just evolutionarily, I snap to attention, right? But after that, it's kind of hard. Maybe somebody raised their voice, maybe, and you all know the cocktail party effect, where you're in the cocktail party and there's white noise in the room, and you do lots and lots of conversations, and you don't actually recognize that person's voice until they say your name. And they're not saying it to you. They just mentioned your name, and suddenly you hear that, which shows, of course, and you can hear the sentence that they were saying up until when they said their name. This is testable, which means you actually were paying attention to it. It just wasn't popping into consciousness for you to. So these are very, very hard questions, especially for things like advanced blending. What I would say is that an awful lot of language,
right,
a huge amount of language, not just language, gesture, positioning things in the room. Now we go into the theater. Now you go into your study. Now you go into a dining room. That human cultures have worked very, very hard to engineer techniques to try to help them filter, but also to be aware, right? So, and you have to invent them. You go into the dining room, looks like a dining room. You recognize it now. You have a frame for a dining room. And you see that, you know, the fork is on the left and the plate is in the middle and the knife is next on the right and then the spoon is further out on the right. And so now this tells you that this is a certain kind of, this is not a fast food restaurant. Somebody actually set this table and, you know, your bread is over here and your drink is over here. And so sort of without knowing it, you filter, adjust, get the right frame, figure, and of course you make mistakes. But what I would say is what my simplistic answer to what helps our brains filter is culture. Culture sets you up and conditions you with certain kinds of patterns, form meaning pairs, blends of form meaning pairs, such that if you don't get that recognition, then you kind of count as an outsider.
Right.
You know, you count as a foreigner, or you're not part of this culture, or there's some kind of problem, maybe you're sick, right? Cultures have really impressed upon us that there are certain kinds of things that we have to recognize, and if we don't, then there's a problem with us, and they train us in it, and one of those things is form meaning pairs in language.
Right. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for your answer. Very enlightening. And we have one more and maybe last question by João Paulo. João, are you there? Hi, John. João Paulo.
Did he type the question into the chat?
He did type the question. Yes, it's rather long. Can you find out? It's where it says João Paulo Rodrigues de Lima.
I'll look.
Yeah, because he didn't leave the room, so I wonder why he is not answering. João?
Maybe he doesn't know how to unmute his.
Yeah. Actually, he says.
Here is João Paulo Rodrigues de Lima. Good afternoon, he says. That's not a question. So it must be down here. I'm looking for it in the chat.
It's just after.
I have a question. For hypothetical situations such as if I had sold my car, I would have bought a house last year, for example, is time here still understood as linear? Maybe not. Maybe not. Counterfactuals are a wonderful subject. I've got a lot of publications on them at markturner.org. Just go to the publications and search for counterfactuals. In particular, I have articles on counterfactuals in political science arguments. You know, if only Brazil had not elected Bolsonaro, then blah blah. It's about that. Well, it's about that kind of thing, right? How do people?
It's the whole story.
See, yes, but it's very interesting because history happens only once. You can't run the controlled experiment. So how can you go back and surgically change something, right? What gives you the idea that you can run these counterfactual experiments about the past? Now, for the future, they're just hypothetical, but you still are doing causal surgery and you're deciding which one to go down. But notice there are all cases of elaborate blending across causation, agency, time, and space. The conception of time in counterfactuals is at least as complicated as the conception of times and things that we think to be true, that are realis. So I would just say that it's very complicated, and there are certain kinds of patterns. There are certain kinds of patterns. So for instance, there's a large number of these counterfactuals that involve getting rid of linear time. So in Doctor Who basically saves the universe again and again and again and again, because for him, time is not linear. It's locally linear. It's locally linear except for a lot of things that happen. But he pops forward and back And so he constantly talking about timey-wimey paradoxes that arise and this kind of, notice these are counterfactuals. You know, what if Doctor Who had been there during the time of Queen Elizabeth? And they have a whole series about it and so on. It's a counterfactual in which the linearity of time is explicitly canceled.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Right. Thank you, Mark.
Sure.
I wonder if Jean is there. Are you there? He left, but I didn't see the sign saying that he left.
That's okay. I'm astonished.
Okay.
We're 45 minutes over time, and there's still 48 people in the room.
Yes, that's very good.
You guys are really troopers. You have great capacity and dedication.
Thank you.
It's very impressive.
Thank you. I wonder if Fabio, because maybe we'd have like 5 minutes for the last question. Maybe Fabio Araújo would like to ask his question, if he's still there. Fabio? Again.
I don't think he's there.
I don't think he is. Yes. All right. Yes.
Oh,
So
sorry,
you,
I am here.
Oh,
I'm here.
you
Sorry.
are.
right.
Hello,
Fabio.
Yeah.
All right.
My question.
Welcome, Fabio.
Hello. My question is written in the chat.
Yes.
I'm just saying that so we can blend frames to create conceptions not only about the future, but to conceptualize past, present, or situations in general, right?
Sure.
So we can.
Frame blending happens across all
the
conceptual
time.
domains and across all times I know about. I'm just focusing on this talk and about conceiving of futures of which you have no experience. Notice you have no experience of a future that's radically different from the one that we live in now. But we still can talk about it and, in fact, make decisions about what to do. But you're quite right. This is a general mental ability that human beings use across every conceptual domain I've ever seen.
Right.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Including the past. Yes.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your time, for your willingness to, be with us and, help with such a marvelous talk. We all learned a lot. Thank you very much.
I turn it back to you and your community. You're the ones who've done all this work, and it's fabulous for me. We talk about how we use other people and we need other people. You have just given me 50 minutes of conversation about my project, and it's brilliant. Thank you for making yourself available during this time. Thank you.
You are mostly welcome. Thank you very
Mark,
much.
Yeah.
Professor,
Yeah.
I'd like to thank you not only for the outstanding talk, it has been quite enlightening, and but also for this moment of questions and answers, which has become a real nice conversation.
Yeah.
Especially that we have had a contribution of Professor Ferrari, Professor Siqueira, Professor Cavalcanti, and Professor Mendonça too, and it has been really great. And as you mentioned that part of your speech would be left for a second time, we'd like to make the arrangements for this.
Well,
later on, it doesn't have to be
Sandra
now.
Cavalcanti and Professor Lilian Ferrari and Professor Rosanna Ferrerato and a lot of other people who know me well will tell you I can talk anytime for as long as you want. So that's not a problem.
Great. So we make the arrangements.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
that'll be a plan for next year, probably.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
I
very
don't want
much.
to overstay my welcome. Bye-bye, everybody.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Okay, very much. Nice seeing Lilian here with us today. Thank you, Lilian, for joining us.
Your mic is off.
Your mic is off. We can't hear you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Lilian. Yes, now in the new arrangement for remote learning, I'm going to use your book, Introduction to Cognitive Linguistics, with my students.
Oh, good.
And I enjoy the exercises. So, you know, since we have to send them so many tasks.
Chapter has a bunch
Yes.
of exercise. Yeah.
Yes, exercise for every chapter. That's very good. So we're going to use that book.
It's part of my bibliography too for the
Very useful.
subject I teach. Yes.
Right.
Good to know.
Queridas, quero agradecer, obrigada, viram? Obrigada.
Obrigada também,
Obrigada.
Alessandra, por estar aqui. Tchau, querida.
Obrigada,
Tudo de
querida.
bom. Tchau,
Tchau,
tchau.
gente.
Tchau.
Filho, eu vou te mandar um e-mail.
Tá ótimo, estou aguardando. Tchau.
Tchau.
Tá bom.
Tchau, Mônica, querida. Tchau.
Tchau, querida. Obrigada pela presença.